Pursuant to Section 84-1412 of the Nebraska statutes, the public is hereby informed that a current copy of the Nebraska Open Meetings Act is located in the board meeting room on the north wall. Roll call, please, Mr. Ray.
Cassidy,
Here.
Godding,
Present.
Hallman,
Here.
America,
Present.
Perlman,
Here.
Ryan,
Here.
Scanlon, Snow,
Here.
Williams. 8 present.
And Ms. Williams did let us know that she was not going to be able to make it this evening due to some things that came up today. So I would entertain a motion to excuse her absence.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Mrs. Godding and a second by Dr. Holman. Roll call, please, Mr. Ray.
Godding,
Aye.
Hallman,
Aye.
America,
Aye.
Perlman,
Aye.
Ryan,
Aye.
Scanlon,
Aye.
Snow,
Aye.
Cassidy.
Aye.
8 aye.
Motion passes. We will move on to our consent agenda, and I would entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda before us.
So move.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Snow and a second by Ms. Ryan to approve the consent agenda. Are there any abstentions? Mr. Scanlon?
I did not get, excuse me, I did not get a chance to look it over, so I'll be abstaining.
Okay. All right, Mr. Scanlon will be abstaining, so roll call, please, Mr. Ray.
Hallman,
Aye.
America,
Aye.
Perlman,
Aye.
Ryan,
Aye.
Scanlon, sorry,
Abstain.
Snow,
Aye.
Cassidy.
Aye.
Godding.
Aye.
7 aye, 1 abstention.
Motion carries. We will move on to information items and item E1A, bond workshop. The purpose of this workshop is to receive an overview of the Phase 2 bond planning recap, related financials, and timeline. And Mr. Evans will be kicking us off.
Thank you, Madam President. Tonight, we're going to be reviewing the information that we've shared with our Community Steering Committee. Most recently was Thursday of last week that we met with this group. We've also had an opportunity to meet with board members who were interested in one-on-one or two-on-two meetings to walk through what materials we'd had in the past, and we've been delineating and defining as we move through that. And I think tonight is about giving you additional details and then asking you for any future direction after you see the additional details that we've worked through on the projects, and also some cost factors that we've also lined out through this. And we have Mr. Summers from Jacobs and also Dr. Turnquist and Jeremy from Jacobs to help us move through this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Jeremy and Dr. Tony.
Thank you, sir. As Mr. Evans indicated, tonight is really an opportunity for the board to have some open dialogue on the Phase 2 planning. What we're going to walk through from an agenda perspective is looking back at the planning efforts that have happened to date, review of some of the financials, some of the same information that you've seen in the past. Talk a little bit about the, again, the timelines, which there's been a lot of discussion on, of course, at the steering team level, and then really giving the board an opportunity to provide us and the staff some feedback on the information they have seen to date, and of course try to answer any questions related to the Phase 2 planning efforts to date, and then ultimately get a sense of direction that the board would like us to continue to move forward on. So what you see in front of you here is really a listing of the board-related planning activities that have occurred over the past several months. Of course, for the folks that were present June 5th, if you recall, really started off kind of the Phase 2 planning effort at a board level. Myself and some of these same similar folks presented a lot of information regarding the Phase 2 planning steps the different action items, in essence, the board would need to take. And then we also talked a lot about the future needs of the district from a capital facilities planning perspective, the trend, enrollment trends that the district really identified in 2014. Research participated in that discussion and really validated that previous information. Again, when we start the planning process, we want to make sure that we have good source data to try to help make recommendations and decisions on. And in the same line with that, of course, we talked about the existing facilities as well, and we referenced the DLR assessment that was completed approximately about a year and a half ago at this point in time, and really identified the processes that they went through to identify some of the raw costs associated with the Phase 2 scopes of work. So that was the initial board workshop. Of course, there were other details discussed, but these are just kind of the high-level items. The next item from a board level perspective was the information item. After the June 5th workshop, the direction that we took was to start working with the steering team on Phase 2 planning, again, having similar conversations about enrollment and those things, and I'll talk about that here on the next slide. But all of those discussions led to the August 21st board meeting. There was an information item provided at that time. And again, it was an update of all the planning effort and discussions at the steering team level, and ultimately ended with the steering team representatives providing a recommendation, or at least describing to the board the conversations that were had over the previous several weeks of meetings that they had. And then the most recent planning process that involved the board, of course, were the small group meetings, where we started walking through at a more detailed level the key areas of work that would be addressed. And then we also reviewed, again, some of the levy information regarding the evaluation, and also provided some information of that similar financial data, how it compares to actual students. So that information was also shared at the board small group meetings. Continuing on the planning recap, the next several meetings here really involve the steering team. We've had 4 steering team meetings to date. Mr. Evans had mentioned the last steering team meeting we have was just this past Thursday, but they started back on August 3rd. And really the August 3rd steering team meeting was very, very similar, identical information that the board received at the initial workshop. So we talked about the different steps and processes associated with bond program planning. We had research present to talk about the different enrollment trends and really validating the capacity needs that the district identified in the 2014 planning process. And then, of course, we talked about the existing facility needs as well. We dismissed that meeting with really the charge of take the information that you've received tonight, talk about it with other community members, organizations you're involved with, and bring some feedback to the meeting, next week's meeting. So on August 10th, the steering team, or the steering committee, reassembled, and a lot of the discussion was really based on the timeline of the program. We didn't, at that point in time, have a lot of detailed scope of work or the total financial picture, so we didn't focus on those two things. What was really discussed, again, was November or fall of 17 timeframe, spring of 18 timeframe, and then fall of 18 timeframe. During this discussion here, the steering team largely or unanimously eliminated the, from their perspective, recommending a November of 18 a referendum, felt that was just too far away. So a lot of the discussion really focused on, again, the fall of 17 or the spring of 18. Other parts of that discussion were focused also on, what are the external, groups that supported the district in the past. What are they saying about the potential referendum? Are they still supportive? Do they still align with the district's needs and commitments to the kiddos? So on August, dismissed everyone after those discussions. August 17th, again, reassembled the steering committee. Again, largely the focus was set on timeline. Received some feedback from the district leadership that the chamber and some of the other groups are largely or unanimously supportive of a May timeframe. We again talked about some of the pros and cons and the planning necessary to achieve those different dates, and ultimately asked the steering team to take a vote. And I believe the results of that was a 5 to 8 vote, 5 for November, 8 for May. But largely the committee felt like they would be supportive of any date that the board wanted to proceed with. If the board felt like November was an appropriate date and things could be done, the steering team would support that. And they also felt like, and I think you heard this on the August 21st recommendation, if the board felt like the May option was a better option, they would want the board to take action on the actual bond planning or referendum approvals sooner than the statutory dates that are required. So they want to make sure that the board can express to the community, we understand this is a priority, we want to do it, we feel this is a better timeline option, but we're willing to approve things sooner to make the other things that need to occur happen. And then ultimately, September 14th, we had a meeting. This was after all the small group meetings with the board members, and they received the same information that that was, I believe it's been made available to all the board members, but the small group meetings where we discussed the key areas to be addressed, the mechanical systems, the LED lighting solutions, of course, the new sites with the different capacities, and those different project details. And then, of course, they received kind of the updated financial piece comparing the overall levy to the per student ratio and some of those other metrics as well. Just keep doing that. So just to kind of segue from kind of that planning recap, just wanted to show and remind everybody overall that from a financial perspective, the current plan totals $399,852,960, $136,625,000 for capital improvements. Again, I'll talk in a moment on how that cost is identified, and then the $263 million there identified for new construction. Again, something that we've shared with the steering team and everybody, but want to remind everyone on the approach. The DLR assessment was utilized for the base scope of work. The assessment provided the district the ability to prioritize all of their critical needs with a 1 through 5 scale. 1 being something that needs to be addressed immediately, 2 something that needs to be addressed within a year, and 3 something that needs to be addressed within 5 years. Our group takes that raw cost of information and we mark it up by the type of project that it is. For capital improvement projects, we mark it up 20%, and that 20% of soft costs, if you will, funds the design of the project, design and engineering, its construction contingency, materials testing, and largely survey, all things that are project costs, but that don't come from the raw cost of the information provided. The difference in the 20 to 24% is FF&E. So on new projects where their FF&E is the furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So on new buildings, they don't have furniture and some of that loose equipment, so that stuff needs to be funded and provided. So that's what that 4% is in the difference between 20 and 24. The program markups then are things that we won't know from a defined scope of work until the actual design of the projects are completed. But we take that project cost and mark that up 20 to 22%. Hazardous material, portables or temporary swing space, commissioning, the program contingency, again, sticking with the methodology that's being utilized in the 2014 program. That's really to ensure all the commitments of scope get done. Sometimes things cost a little bit more. Again, no engineering, no design has been done on any of these projects. We want to make sure that those can be funded appropriately. And then the escalation piece in the cost model, 3% escalation is fairly normal in the construction arena for this marketplace. We escalate the total project cost to the midpoint, which means we escalate it to about 2.5 years out. knowing that you won't see the escalation in the front couple of years or the total amount of escalation, but you'll see it on the back end. So that's a good way to average out escalation. And then, of course, for the new sites, we want to make sure that we're funding the site development appropriately. Sure. And commissioning is really the process and the approach to, in the existing buildings where you're installing new mechanical, new electrical, different equipment like that. This is an independent company that comes in and really synthesizes all of those systems together. So as systems become more technical, you need an expert to really come in and optimize the different systems from an energy perspective. A lot of the capital improvement dollars are there to support sustainable energy solutions. They're energy management systems, changing out old chillers and boilers that are past their useful life, air handling units. So a lot of the equipment in the district's portfolio that consumes a large amount of energy, and the commissioning agent's really there to, one, make sure that things were put in as engineered, and two, to really optimize the function of those systems for air quality and then energy consumption. So that's what the commissioning agent is for. And again, just a reminder on the program cost, since none of the scope of the actual projects is identified, hazardous materials is a good example. Hazardous materials remediated based on the design of the project. We don't let hazardous material dictate the design of the project. So once the design's complete, we can identify with, of course, the experts within OPS and their environmental department what materials need to be remediated, and then we ultimately allocate program dollars to that project to fund that remediation. Oops. So again, just a reminder on capital improvement projects there, you can see the list, of course: Adams, Catlin, Conestoga, Edison, Highland, King, Masters, Pinewood, Spring Lake, an addition at Highlands. The addition at Masters was actually built in phase 1, but we've left that in there because there are some dollars to finish the build out as classrooms. Currently it's a multi-purpose space. So Masters wouldn't structurally be getting an addition. It's been built, but the build out of that. And then of course Spring Lake at the elementary level. Additions at both Morton and Lewis and Clark are identified in the plan. And then also capital improvements at all existing high school sites and of course the Blackburn site as well. And that totals the $136 million component. Keep doing that, sorry. And then in the new construction, of course, there's two new elementary schools, two new elementary school sites. The procurement of those sites have been completed. This year, the elementary schools is $22.6 million. And again, I want to remind everyone, those are the program budgets, if you will. So it's the project, the raw cost, plus the project markup, plus the program markup, which makes this total estimated value. One middle school at the Gateway site, of course, no site procurement related to that facility in this bond program, but $42.3 million estimate. And then, of course, the two high schools, one at the 60th and L Street site and one at 156 and Ida Street site. The program value for those both are equal at $87.7 million, which gives you the total of the $227,000. There we go, thank you. And again, just kind of a look back at that total program matrix, if you will. One of the things we also wanted to kind of recap a little bit was the projected levy increase. You can see from the 2014-15 all the way through to the 2018 how the levy has changed, and then also a projection of what the levy may look like in the future if a referendum was approved and supported by the community. Oops. Similar information that was on the previous slide from a district perspective. The light blue is the existing and the dark blue is the projected, and just wanted everybody to visually be able to see how the district compares with the neighboring districts and adjacent districts on the levy information. This graph is a little bit different. I think, again, most board members have seen this and steering team has seen this. Lincoln, if you can see on the far right-hand side, has been added to this information. But really, this is the assessed value per student. So you can see where OPS sits in that, really at the lowest value there. And then this is a similar result. Again, Lincoln Public Schools on the end, being the second largest district in the state. And this is really related to bond levy proceeds, if you will. You can see, again, the district really, from a per-student perspective, really at the bottom of the values there as well. Just gonna talk a little bit about the timelines. When we first came in June, we kind of talked again about 3 different timelines. Really, November of 17. November of 17 would be subject to the election commissioner's approval. The district would ultimately have to request his or her or that body's approval to do a special election, and then they would ultimately determine how that would be handled, if it would be mail-in or if it would be an in-person vote. The key thing with the November election at this point in time, the board ultimately would have to, there would need to be a special board meeting. Tonight, obviously, the board can't take any action because it's an information item, but the board would need to be able to take action and direct the staff to not only assemble the referendum, but also approve that referendum so it could be filed by the deadline of September 25th. The May of 18 election would not be a special election. It would be combined with other items on the primary election ballot. The election commissioner, that follows kind of the normal filing process. But you would have to file no later than mid-March of 18. I can't recall the exact primary date, but it's 50 days prior to when the actual ballot is voted on is the statutory requirement there. The other thing, just to kind of briefly note on the special election, it's my understanding that the district ultimately would have to fund the special election cost. And then depending on if that would be shared with anyone else, again, is a determination by the election commissioner's office. In May, the district still would have to fund, no different than they have in the previous, a portion of the May primary election ballot. But it's prorated based on all of the other items on the election ballot and the value of your particular item on the ballot. So again, that would be kind of to be determined, but that's the process as I understand it from council on how that would work. That was really the recap. We wanted to kind of pause here, I did, to try to give a chance for the board to ask questions and have some dialogue about what we've been talking about over the last several weeks. We do have all of the information that has been shared in the small group setting, key items to be addressed, the large spreadsheets and all that information, but wanted to first pause and see if there are questions or discussion. And then if we wanted to, or upon request, we can definitely dive into any of those specific items if requested to.
Mr. Scanlon.
I did not attend one of the Bond 101 meetings, which is presented to the board, because I had thought that that those meetings, my understanding was when we left, that those meetings were going to be mainly to inform and educate board members that had not gone through a bond before, and all the ins and outs of what it takes to, get a measure on the ballot, and also then the bond process. I guess I was not, I did not think that we would have specifics as far as what would be recommended from the district to be on the second phase of the bond. I know that, I guess back in 2014, I believe it was, when it was presented as a two-phase bond, that those, there were items placed, or there was suggestions made at that time, but then we had the DLR group come in and do an assessment, so I guess I'm a little confused as to where we stand, and the steering committee, what's been presented to them, and communication as far as from the board and I guess board officers, what's been communicated with the steering committee. I guess I just feel a disconnect from where I thought we left it the last time was board members, or I should say, board members that have not been through a bond would be kind of explained the bond process, what happens if a bond gets approved, and then the process through that, levies and everything like that. So I guess I'm just a little, I'm a little confused on that.
And I apologize if there was a misunderstanding, but what was presented was the information of what was that original Phase 2. When we discussed the bond in 2014, what was listed as Phase 2 combined with the DLR assessment, as far as what needed to be moved out of that assessment that was a priority need into a Phase 2 bond as well. And I believe that's the same information that's been presented to the steering committee? Yes. We have not gotten into a level of detail like we did in 2014 yet, as far as, well, this is a project that has to be in a bond issue for me. This is a project that has to be in a bond issue for me. That level of detail has not been gotten into yet, if that answers your question.
I guess, I don't know if it does or not. I just thought that those Bond 101, which I did not attend because my understanding was it was going to be an informational item, because going through the first phase of the bond, I learned a lot as far as, where funds can come from to promote a bond. What does it mean to go out for a tranche of bonds? I guess I don't know. I guess it would have been nice to know with the DLR assessment and what we had discussed years ago, where we stand right now.
And I'm sure we can work with Mr. A and Dr. Turnquist to get a meeting set up for you to go over that information as well. Again, I'm sorry if that was not fully communicated and that wasn't your understanding. Mr. Snow?
Thank you. I would say, for me, just an explanation on this, for the Bond 101, I don't think anybody that did attend the Bond 101 knew what we were going to be getting presented, because I believe it was Jacobs that was leading that. So we got this binder, and it was on the September 11th, and that's when they just went through the entire binder and went through everything with us. So just from the board officer's perspective, there was no communication on what was actually going to be fully presented. So it wasn't what was going through a bond, but we can get another meeting set up.
Then I guess that brings me to another question, and I asked this before. Where are we with Jacobs and a potential second phase of the bond? What do we, I guess, are we paying them for certain services that are being provided? I guess I'd really like to have a little bit more communication, because we're talking about a $400 million second bond, which is almost as much as the first phase, and I guess I don't feel like that's been communicated.
Well, and we don't have a second, and please members of the exec council jump in if I'm not stating things correctly. But we don't have a second phase bond that we voted on going out for yet. And until we do that, we would not be able to vote on Jacobs being like a project manager for that bond program. And so any work that's being done right now would fall under the current contract that we have. Dr. Turnquist?
Right now, yes, it does, but that would depend upon how much that work builds up. We currently do not have any invoicing from Jacobs for any of the work they have done thus far, even though it's not a part of the first bond. But if that were to expand, then if more time and labor was put into it, then we could consider being invoiced on an as-needed basis.
Do we know what a threshold dollar amount that is?
No, but we can easily cover it. I know it's going to be minimal. I have that promise.
Okay, I just
It will
want to
be
make sure
minimal.
that, I mean, a lot of business models don't have volunteer
Oh,
work done, you
That's
know.
true, that's true,
So-
and there's been already a lot of extra time and effort put into it, but we have had no invoices yet, and I don't anticipate huge costs on that.
Okay, I just want to make sure that, you know, we're not damaging relationships with Jacobs.
No.
And also that they are being compensated
No.
as needed.
I'll ask Mark if I've damaged my relationship with him. I don't think so. No, not at all. That's a good question, though, Mr. Scanna.
And I do think it's one we'll have to address somewhere down the line as we actually get into a board vote on exactly what direction we're going. Then we would need to formalize a relationship with a board approval on that as well. That would be coming.
And I don't obviously remember everything perfectly, but the last time, did we not have, we had a contract for pre-voting with them, I believe, and then if it was approved, then we had a different contract with them, is that correct?
That's correct. That is correct. Little different scenario here where we had a lot of the work they actually did in the first phase because a lot of the materials that we just looked at tonight were developed during the phase one build-up because we didn't know we were going to end up, when they first started, splitting it into two. So I'm not suggesting they're not putting some time in and that Jeremy's not working past 5. I think he is, but it is a little different than that first one where they had a ton of work up front that we haven't had to do since they did so much of it at the first part of phase one.
Mr. Perlman?
Thank you. I have a couple questions as it relates to the projected costs of the Phase 2 of the bond, which was done prior to the Phase 1 of the bond. In the binder, we were provided this spreadsheet, and if you look at the elementary subtotal, for example, it was estimated to be just shy of 70 million, but now it's come in at about 50% of that cost, at about 37 million. Some of the examples are very striking, like Masters Elementary, 6.4 million, and now it's down to 1.6 million. Edison, 5.6 million was the projected cost, and that's been shrunk down to 3.3 million. Adams, 5.25 million, down to 2.1. The cost of the 2 new high schools was projected to be just under $121 million, and that's increased almost 50%. And I guess I'm wondering why.
So on your first question regarding the program costs identified in the 2014 model compared to what you're seeing or what you've seen over the past few discussions, the real difference is the assessment that the 2014 scope of work was based on was not a prioritized assessment. So a different way to think about that is the assessment that 2014 was based on was doing all 1 through 5 scope. If you're looking at the priority scale that I kind of explained earlier. The current program or the current plan uses the priority scale, the 1 being immediate, 2 being within a year, 3 being within 5 years, to identify the critical systems that need to be replacements. For example, in the 1 through 5 priority list, if you look at DLR's total assessment and capture all the priorities, window replacement's going to be in there, brick tuck pointing, and there's other components of the building that just aren't within the 1 through 3 prioritization from a criticality perspective. So that's really the fundamental or the approach difference between the 2014 facilities assessment or planning assessment would be doing all of the scope 1 through 5 from a priority perspective, which is different than, of course, just doing the 1 through 3, which are, again, the 5-year. Typically, when you get past the 5-year window in capital planning, it gets a little bit difficult, just because of enrollment trends change, curriculum needs change, codes change. There's a lot of other things that change. So in a lot of facility planning, that 5 year is kind of the far right side of trying to capitally forecast costs and types of construction. So that's on the existing facility or the capital improvement scopes of work. On the new construction, at the time that those values were identified, exactly what sites the district was going to even be able to procure was unknown. There was information, just generally speaking, where the needs of those facilities were. But once they're ultimately identified, you can estimate or gather cost information related to site development. The other thing I would also mention regarding a high school, the district's got great experience building elementary schools in a very specific space planning template, and they also have great experience in middle schools and have a space planning template, but at the high school level, that doesn't exist. So when the estimate or the cost information was assembled for the new high school, it was largely just based on models outside of what OPS's needs ultimately are. So in the last 6 and 7 months, we've been working with curriculum and other folks, community members as well, to really identify what is the space planning needs for OPS high schools, and in order to support those space needs identified specifically for the districts, you see the cost estimate has increased. There's also additional escalation, and there's other costing factors, but those are the primary reasons.
Okay, so I guess one question I would still have related to that is that looks like the high school estimates kind of vary wildly as well. What was behind the increase from $4.8 million in 2014 for Phase 2 at Benson to $11.7 million?
And Jeremy, please chime in if I'm not accurate, but the space or the planning effort related to Benson's facility, I believe initially the 2014 assessment was largely architectural, windows and different components like that. However, when the DLR assessment was completed, they identified a large need for mechanical system modernization. Usually the MEP or the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, the infrastructure are the largest costs inside of building construction. So moving from modernizing architectural components inside of the building to really replacing all the existing mechanical critical systems, that's where you're going to see the cost difference at that particular site.
I think my last question for now would be related to Central, which was estimated to cost $14.7 million and is now down to less than 50% of that 7 million. So what is it that are priorities 4 and 5 that have been left off to reduce the cost by 7.7 million for Central High?
I don't have that information with me tonight. I have to work with the district that has the overall assessment, but that's something we can definitely get back to you through Matt Ray, I think in a fairly quick period of time.
Okay, thanks.
Mrs. Gadding.
So I've got quite a few questions, quite a few things here to say. First, I want to thank the parents and the community members who have stayed engaged and who also served on the steering committee, because I know that that takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and clearly you got to spend August at least once a week with staff people. So I think that's important. I have to say that I'm disappointed in how slow this process has been, and maybe feel a bit like, I know I feel probably a little bit like Mr. Scanlon in just disjointedness and maybe communication. You know, we kind of started last February. Mr. Snow, you were out in my sub-district. We had a big meeting, 150 people were there. And it just seems like we're still not where I feel like we could be by this point in time. I mean, I feel like we're not quite there. So, and it'd be one thing if we just had a gazillion other things going on that we've been doing, but I don't know that that's been the case either. So I do appreciate the comment, because I've gotten a lot of folks who've said to me, how did the numbers get developed for this particular piece? And, you know, I know it wasn't board members, because you just said, I mean, nobody really knew what was going to be. I do think going forward would be really helpful for board officers to find out what's going to be presented at small group meetings, and then get a hold of everybody so that they kind of know, and so that they can be included in the activities. But what I would like to just talk about is a few different things, and some of them maybe even back to something that Mr. Perlman had brought up. So the items that are in here, I know Ms. Merrick just said we haven't gotten into the detail, but yet I feel like when we had our small group discussions, I feel like we did get into some details on what is or isn't in there. I also think it's a bit confusing. So to Mr. Perlman's point, because in this round, what you're seeing is program project soft cost and program cost in the number. In the last one, and correct me if I'm wrong, to the Jacobs team, that wasn't how we put those numbers out there. They were different. So we don't have an apples to apples comparison, which I think is going to be a bit confusing for the public, because you go from one thing to the other. So either we're going to have to figure out how to communicate that well, or figure out if we want to do it like we did last time, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. So I think that you see in the new high school cost, because of what is now in it versus what was in it before. So those are some of the things that I think have happened. I guess I want to make sure that as we go through this, because there is definitely some detail in these buildings of what's in it and what isn't in it. And I think to Mr. Perlman's point, you know, here's the items that we said we were going to do last time, and now here's what we're coming up with. We're going to have to be really clear on what the priorities are, because if we said we were going to put this much money into something, and now we're not putting the money into something, and I can see everyone in the audience shaking their head yes, it gets a little bit strained. And so I think we're going to have to be really careful on that, because people's perceptions of what we said, which will end up being 4 years ago when we get to it, versus what's on the list, may be a bit of a challenge for us. And I know that even though we haven't talked in detail, we have, when we were in our small groups, I mean, there's definitely some items. Sub-District 4, I mean, that parking and drive in front of Northwest, that's a huge priority. And we're not going to have money going forward just to fix things. I mean, we just aren't. And so we need to understand that. The Pinewood School and the community and what they're expecting. So how are we going to engage the community on those types of things? Sub-District 8, the initial plans called for a health clinic in the new high school, and I think right now it's a bare bones, not necessarily there. Sub-District 9, and the way we're putting the cost into this bond of new elementaries versus how it was in the old one, and when you look at a Columbian cost versus the new elementary schools, it's not apples to apples, but it's going to be confusing for people to understand. Oh, why could we spend 16 million, but now we're going to spend 22 million, essentially almost in the same time period. So I think we're going to have to be really clear on communication. In my sub-district, I've heard a lot of folks bring this up, and it also goes back to the high school at 60th and L as well. And I think this is where, as a board, it's going to be really, really important that we figure out what's the vision we want for our schools and what message are we sending out to our community. Because when we think about the big picture, right now, neither school has a pool included, although in my community that was a huge item. So when we get down to it, we only have, if I'm correct, 8 swimming pools in this district. And when we build these new facilities, we'll have 22 facilities that are supposed to use those 8 schools. And I've asked the district to tell me, how in the world are we going to do that? Because what are we saying to our students? We're not going to provide those opportunities when we know that around the state, Class A schools, when you build them, you put a swimming pool in because that's, it's there. It's important for the students to be able to swim on campus, and then use the middle schools for extra practices. Some of our high schools can't even hold swim meets. And so I think that it's going to be really important that we figure out as a board, what are our priorities? What are we saying to our kids? Ralston, for instance, requires that every high school student pass a swimming test before they graduate from high school. It's a safety issue. It's important to them, and they as a board have taken a really serious approach to that. So I'm really concerned about how we look at it from a big picture standpoint and the messages we send as we develop, because these plans have been pretty developed, and I mean, we know, for instance, that neither of the new high schools has a plan for a stadium. But then what are we going to do to make sure that we have the proper space and that our current facilities can handle another high school at a stadium? I think that's important for us to know. So, and in my sub-district, I took a look at the number of acres we bought, and we bought over 80 acres at a cost of $7.4 million. At 60th and L, we bought 40 acres at a cost of $16.8 million. I would suggest in my sub-district we sell off some land and get that swimming pool and some of the other things that were really important to the community taken care of, because we apparently don't need it. So I just feel like we need to make sure that we're communicating, and that as a board we understand where we're headed with this. So some of the things that I would ask for, and that seem to me to be logical next steps, would be for board officers to create a timeline with administration of all critical tasks necessary to have a bond vote in May, because clearly we're not ready. We have a lot of unknowns right now. I would also suggest that, as was done in the 14 bond, that we do small group opportunities to meet with the board president and get through these items that are really important to our communities. That hasn't been done, which I would have thought would have been done before we got to tonight. I would engage the community. I also want to know about data to support some of the items we've got going on. Data as related to elementary school populations, how we would set up attendance areas and those kinds of things. We got a lot of data before from research on that, and I know they can do that. I would ask if there's anything we can do to accelerate the work of land prep, since we're not going to get till May. And And I would prepare on the website a link of frequently asked questions so that as community members have questions, I mean, I'm getting a lot of them, that we have those addressed, and then more specifics for each school. Because what we really need is we need everybody in this whole community to engage and want to know what we can do to pass the bond. And we need to, we need the sexy things in there too, besides the air conditioning and the heating, right? So that's important. So I would ask, clearly in the book that we got, lots of stuff related to energy. I would ask if we've done an estimate on energy savings on consumption. I would think that that's something we should know. And then I would also like to see a report on the bonds that are going to roll off, so that we know how our levy is going to be impacted as we go forward. I know that they may not be rolling off soon, but they'll be rolling off sometime in the next 10 years. So I'd like to see that. That's going to be important for our community to understand. Oh, we're adding to our levy, but we're going to take away from our levy as we move forward. So I think that's an important thing. And then I know I've asked this before, but I want to make really sure that in the amounts that got included in this giant binder and that are here, DLR had specifically said when they gave that presentation that there were amounts that were being completed in phase 1, and they still included them in the DLR study. I just want to make sure those have been pulled out and stripped out. If they've already been done, I want to make sure that we aren't doubling up on those costs and entering them again. So those are some of the things that I would like to see. I really just want to see communication really ramp up on this as we move forward and make sure that we're all engaged in the same process so that we can get to the positive end result we want.
And I know Dr. Kernquist has some information, but I do want to say part of why we're having this meeting is so that we can get started on that timeline and the other activities that need to happen, because before administration can do that, our board needs to give direction to them of saying, and it's us saying, no, I think we should be looking at May, I think we should be looking at November through our discussion tonight so that we can move forward with some of those activities that need to be happening. I think we did have a lot of things happening this summer. We did implement a new student assignment plan and a new transportation plan, and we had multiple board members. I was gone part of the summer. I know other board members were gone a significant part of the summer, that we couldn't have workshops and do that type of thing and get everyone together to make sure we were all getting the information. I think now that has calmed down, that's why we're able to have this workshop and to go forward with having more of those small group meetings and things that we did in 2014, so that we can get the ball rolling a little bit faster now. Dr. Turnquist.
Thank you. I want to thank Mrs. Gotting, because everything she said is everything we're ready to do as soon as the board gives us direction to begin the serious planning. I don't think she identified one thing that isn't on our agenda, and we're eager to get rolling with all of that. So what we need tonight is direction from the board to begin that serious planning and to come back to you on a regular basis with updates and reports on all of those things, including also, I'm pleased to hear her mention the roll-off of the bonds, because we already have that data ready to go. We just need to know that you want us to start seriously moving forward with this movement towards a Phase 2 bond, and that's basically what we need for you to share with us tonight.
Mrs. Scotting.
Well, I think 100% I'm ready to move forward. I think I've been saying that since February or last year. So I'm ready to go. So I don't need, I just want us to start moving forward and get some of these questions answered and get some of this stuff nailed down so that we have more confidence in the community, that we give the community confidence that we've actually done the work that we should be doing.
I just would add to Dr. Turnquist, we're willing and ready to do that. We've not had clear board direction. I agree that you have felt that way. I do not agree that Dr. Turnquist, myself, or Jacobs has had that clarity from a board majority. So I guess I would want to say that. But I agree with everything you said, and Dr. Turnquist and I, except for the selling of the land. I don't know how many acres you wanted to sell. That one I didn't know about. That was the only thing that was a new one to me. But everything else that you said is exactly right, and exactly what we would do once we have board majority direction. But it's very difficult for us to react. The last board vote was for us to form a steering committee, of which we did about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, to see some flavor from community leadership, and it was very positive from that group, of which they came back to the school board and reported out. I believe that was 2 weeks ago, something like that. And so that's where we're at. We are ready, but again, we have to have some direction and action, and I don't know if everyone on the board's ready for that today. I think we're getting closer, and I think the conversations that we just had tonight help us move that direction, because it's a big issue. It's different today than it was in 2014, certainly not as convoluted as we were trying to put so many pieces together in a very rapid fashion. Here it's not quite as convoluted, but it's still difficult as we look at these numbers tonight, and had some really good questions from everybody. So I think we're quite willing and able to begin a more total process, but we really need direction to do that. And obviously tonight's just a workshop. It's not an action. There's no action that can be taken tonight. But in our next meeting, if we're getting that direction to have an agenda item, we'll certainly have an agenda item. And I think we'll certainly talk with the board officers about that. Dr. Turnquist and I will.
Dr. Turnquist.
One other thing I would add is that Mrs. Gotting mentioned some specifics about some of the facilities, and those are things that we don't decide. Those are board decisions, but you certainly will want community input on those things. So we're eager to move forward if you just give us the word.
And I would just add to that anything that's been presented and or discussed is really just a thought, because without board action, it is not a reality. And so everything we've talked about is based on 2014 and DLR, but the board has the authority to do exactly what they want to do. I mean, that's the reality. At the end of the day, you decide. You tell us what projects you do want, what projects you don't want, and what kind of data you want collected. I heard quite a few comments, which I think are very appropriate, on lots of data that we need to collect for you, and we do, and we're willing to do that. But at the end of the day, the board will decide exactly what it is and exactly what it isn't, which is kind of difficult, as you recall from 2014. I mean, at the end of the day, it's because there's always more needs than we think the appetite of the voter is, and that's one of our challenges too. And also, we kind of gave the voters a general approximate cost in 2014, which doesn't mean the board can't do something different. You have the authority to do whatever you want to do on that actual number. We've been working off that approximate number that we told the community in 2014. But again, that's still your choice. If you choose to say, I think it's too high, or I think it's too low, and we need X or Y, we're certainly willing to look at changes. We've just tried to stay within the parameters of the 2014 conversation to some extent, although, as Mr. Perlman pointed out, certainly we've had some movement on some of those 2014 numbers as well, which is why we need to have those good conversations with the school board too, to decide which ones aren't enough and which ones are too much. And I think that's the future too, is making those decisions.
Mr. Snow?
Thank you, Madam President. I remember when we were having this discussion of having a Phase 1 and Phase 2 bond, and I think we, as a district, as a community, for an urban school district that is continuing to grow, I believe we have 800 more students in our district than we did the previous year. We need a second phase bond. I do have some concerns over numbers. I do have a question that I did pose to you guys in the Bond 101 meeting about how many portables do we have now, how many portables we'll have after the 2014 bond is done, and how many portables will we have left once the Phase 2 bond is done, because I think that is something that voters want to know. I mean, if they're going out and they're putting their hard-earned income in, they want to know when they roll back up to their elementary or middle school that there's going to be less portables outside that next school year. I do believe we need to continue to have the community engagement. One of the things that Ms. Ryan and I we were just mildly talking is I do know there are some schools that are doing some additional work on their with private funds, and I want to. That's one of the things. Once we kind of really break down all the numbers, I want to make sure that we're not adding numbers that already a private project is already doing, or if that project needs something to connect, that we're all on the same page. I do understand we have needs in North Omaha, South Omaha, as well as in Northwest Omaha with capacity. And I think that is something that we as a board have to do because we have to meet the needs of the 52,000 kids in our district. I did have an additional question on, and it wasn't in here, but I had an opportunity to tour some additional OPS facilities, and I just had a question for operations. How many other facilities do we own in OPS that we're currently not using, or just property? Just to kind of get a number of that, because we have some properties that are just fenced off, and their numbers aren't in here for a potential bond to be updated. So are we just getting rid of them? What is the plan on getting rid of some of the facilities that we currently no longer need, which would kind of help us kind of bring down this 399 number, which I've had some people in the community tell me, it's like, ooh, that's a stretch, but as long as it doesn't go over 400, it's something we can have a discussion on. So again, I do believe we have to do some more research. I completely echo everything Ms. Godding has said, Mr. Pullman, as well as Mr. Evans. But I think it's something as a board is giving direction. If I'm correct, Mr. Evans, tonight you guys are looking for us to give you guys directions to get the ball rolling, not confirming a number, not confirming projects, but to get the ball rolling. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All righty, so I'm on board. Thank you.
Mrs. Cassidy.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you. So I did go to the Board 101 meeting, which I felt was very beneficial. So thank you, folks, for all of your hard work. I wish I would have brought my binder tonight. But this past week, I had a chance to really go into some of my schools in my sub-district. And I'll tell you what, they don't care about pools. They don't care about anything extra. They just want space. It almost broke my heart in some of these schools. I mean, I couldn't believe how some of these schools utilize their space that they have. They are utilizing every nook and cranny to put kids in. And one principal, and I visited a few schools, but one of the principals actually took the time to go in her office and give me a breakdown of each classroom and, you know, all her first grade teachers, all her second grade teachers, and had numbers next to them with this number of students. I mean, looking at some of these classes that have 26, 27 kids, I'd go out of my mind if I was a teacher and had to teach 27 first graders. So I think in my area, the need is incredible. They understand that they're not going to get everything that they want and that some things are going to have to be privately funded later. They just want space. And I think if we just present each school, keep it simple. Here's this school's getting this school's getting this. Let our constituents know exactly what projects we do decide on. They'll want it. My area will want it. As long as we, as a board, can present the information easily to all of our sub-districts, I think the need, in every corner of Omaha, every pocket of our city, these schools are busting at the seams. If you haven't seen it, go into your schools firsthand, and it's there. To reiterate what Mrs. Godding said, though, even from as much as I learned from the Board 101, I do need a little bit more of a clear understanding as far as the timeline, just obviously playing catch-up in all of this. What steps are taken next? Like, for instance, you answered a few of my questions tonight, but I kind of left the meeting wondering, is everything set in stone? Is this completely set? And that seems to be not the case. That's part of what is our role. So that would be a little bit helpful too, is just kind of more of a timeline as far as when everything happens. And if we are set on the primary and we're done with November, let's clearly lay out what needs to happen. That would be helpful, I think, for everyone. Thanks.
Dr. Turnquist.
I agree with you 100%. As soon as we get direction that you want us to start rolling forward seriously with this, then we will do a timeline right off the bat.
Well, I'm on board.
Mr. Snow.
My mentor sitting right behind me reminded me of something I was trying to think of earlier. I actually wrote it down on the paper. So I remember you guys did a presentation to the board, was it a year ago, a little bit over a year ago, of a career center and potential, what that number, anything like that. I would also be interested, I understand this is the board decision, but I would be interested to find out if you guys could send board members, or when we start having these meetings, of things that the district is looking to enhance in our district. Things that, obviously, a lot of our alternative programs in the district, they cannot sustain going out, getting a bond. Nobody's going to go out mostly and vote for them because they serve a very small, unique population. So are there projects, are there programs in our district that we might have to put on this? We're thinking this bond is going to, it's 4, 5, 6 years down the road. That's if we even go out for another bond. Are there programs in the district that are at capacity that need that extra assistance? That wasn't in that bond 101, but I do know OPS probably does, but.
I think that presentation was done by CIA. It was then called CIA, it's CIS now.
CIS.
But we certainly will collaborate with our colleagues in CIS to see what they have to say. Now, they do work with us on the conceptual designs for the 2 high schools. That's been extremely important to have them involved in that. But as for other programs, which is what I think you're talking about, we can talk with our colleagues there to see what they want to place on the table for discussion.
And I think just adding to that, I think when you guys do present that to board members, I think it would be good to see what every board member is probably interested in, because I think we have, as a board, have always been talking about career education, and I think really having that go down, Mr. Scanlon, I think that could really kind of further empower the conversation. Thank you.
Mr. Perlman.
Thank you. Being a 9-month member of the board, I guess that my question would be, what sort of direction is administration seeking? Because the board has given approval to move forward. We okayed a bond steering committee, and then I went to the bond 101, and I have it listed here. I think part of the difficulty is we're, to a large degree, talking about 2 separate things in one bond. We're talking about 5 new schools, that's one thing, and then we're talking about capital improvements. And this booklet contains all the capital improvements that it was my understanding, this is what the needs show. And it's essentially tens of millions of dollars in boilers and chiller replacements and lights. There's some big projects like Lewis and Clark. There's some classroom additions. So I guess that's my question. What sort of guidance do you want? I don't want to get in the weeds and travel from school to school and recommend what to do in every school.
Let me see if I can help a little bit, and I know Dr. Turnquist probably has some things too. I think the difference with where we're at today versus where we were a month and a half ago when the board did vote to form a steering committee, and to basically, the other piece that came from the steering committee and from the board was to get some basic sentiment from some community groups, including groups like the Chamber of Commerce. But what we were getting consensus was not just on the bond. The big thing that the board wanted us to look at about a month and a half, 2 months ago, was November versus May. And so I think we now have clarity for something that allows us to do a timeline. We didn't have that until really tonight, because a month and a half ago, we were still having the steering committee. They were working through that and actually came to the board with a recommendation just a week and a half ago. And so we hadn't had an official position on whether November or May, really, I think I'm hearing it tonight, because if you wanted to do November, you'd have to have a special board meeting for a resolution this week. You would ask for us tonight to put on the agenda a special board meeting on Wednesday or Thursday of this week with a resolution for a bond issue that would be on November's ballot. Barring that happening tonight, if you don't do that tonight, then you've just given us some direction, and you're also given direction on moving forward. We did not have that until tonight. We didn't know. I heard different things, and I think staff heard different things from different board members and the community as well. And the Community Steering Committee went back and forth. It was at least 2 or 3 meetings, Mr. Summer, I think, where that was part of the agenda too. So you kind of had 2 agendas working. One was, what are the projects? 2, when do we talk to voters about it? And 3, the steering committee saying, well, go meet with some other groups and find out what they think. And so they put me on a quest to come back to them, which was appropriate. And so all of those things have happened just within the last month and a half. That's really when that all has occurred. And then tonight, I think, is kind of a final direction on a timeline that we can now come back with to the board, that we can present with an action item in the future. Is that, Dr. Turnquist, where you were at?
Yes, I think that's true. And I think the other thing we've seen in the steering committee is the steering committee starting to gel, understanding the capacity needs in South Omaha, the overcrowding capacity needs in far west Omaha in terms of bringing some students back to the district and not making them travel 8 miles to their high school. But one of the things I heard loud and clear was folks in the steering committee comment on there needs to be something for everyone in this bond issue. It can't be focused on just a certain part of the city or just 2 parts of the city. And we have tremendous needs in all of our schools, needs that we will never be able to address with the general fund. Systems that have to be made whole. You start to have systems failing, it doesn't matter how beautiful your building is if the systems fail. And we have, if we look at priorities 1, 2, and 3 in that DLR assessment, approximately $240 million worth of need just in system functionality alone. Now, based on, and Mrs. Gotting mentioned this, I appreciate her mentioning this also, some of the things have been addressed in phase 1. Some of the things will be addressed in phase 2. And if we can be successful with phase 2, our estimate is we can bring that $240 million worth of need down to about $65 million. And then we move on from there as we move forward after this next bond. So all of those things work together. The beauty of the building works with the systems. If your roof leaks, it doesn't matter what kind of seats you put in the auditorium, they're going to be ruined. So you have to make certain that you're balancing everything. But I appreciate what Mrs. Cassidy said about crowding in some of those schools. We have schools, elementary schools in South Omaha that, in my view, it's immoral. The capacity, the overcapacity rate of some of those schools.
And I know we don't have the number of how many seats in portables will be removed with the bond issue, because we don't have real clear delineation. We're close, I think, but I don't think we have clear delineation yet. But I do know today we've got 148 portables at the elementary level. We have 75 at the middle school level. I believe it's 45 at the high school level. And even with that, we're still in every nook and cranny of many, many of our schools. So the need is abundantly clear when you look at well over 200 portables throughout our district. And as I said in a recent meeting, you can call them cottages and you can do a lot of things to them, but it's still a portable. It's still a portable.
So, I guess it's still for me kind of where I've been for more than a year now. It's almost like a chicken and the egg thing. I mean, I'm being asked to endorse a bond when half of it is, I mean, we have it listed out of things here, mostly temperature control units and boilers. And if that's needed, I'll support a bond for that. But what I'm hearing tonight is it's up to us as a board to give direction as to what we want included in that bond. And so do we endorse moving forward with a bond and then decide later what we're going to spend money on? Or do we get the information first on what we're going to spend the money on before we endorse or not?
That's a good question, Mr. Perlman. As Mr. Evans said, ultimately, it's the board that decides if the number's too high or too low in terms of what you're going to ask for in the bond issue. But we will look at the basic functional absolute need in each facility. And then we can list out as separate line items other things that board members have mentioned in addition to those basic needs. And it's the board that has to make those final decisions. And that's where you will want some community input. And it's a long process.
Okay, that's fair. Thanks.
Mr. Scanlon?
I guess just to provide you, just from what had happened on the first phase, first you got to say, yes, we're interested in starting the process, and then the administration will begin that process, and it will bring back and say, this is our, our dream package of things that we'd love to have, and that's when the kind of slashing of things go on and say, well, okay, the community, the first bond, I think it was like, I don't know, $1 billion or something like that, just, an astronomical number, and then the board was like, no, we can never get that passed. So that's kind of where it was, that it starts with just, yes, the board is willing to support a bond, but we don't necessarily know what that bond would consist of at this time. And that's kind of the process. So that's, I guess, what the administration is just saying. Before we don't want to go out and waste time bringing to the board something that they're not ever going to support. So that's just kind of what the process has been through the first phase. So
Thanks, and I appreciate that. And I just to put it on the record, I am supportive of another bond. The capacity alone makes it worthwhile to bring it forward and start that conversation because it's beyond a critical need. And if we have to adjust on the other aspects of it, we'll obviously do that. But we're past due on the capacity needs. So I'm in favor of moving forward.
okay. And then just a couple of questions I had for Jacobs. You put up there some percentages. If you could go back a couple of slides as far as some for estimating purposes, like the 30%. Yes, there, that one. How did, I assume that you guys use this, if I remember correctly, you use this model for the first phase of the bond. How did those projections and estimates match up so far with the actual costs on the current bond projects?
I can provide you kind of a side-by-side, project-by-project comparison. But all, from a budget perspective, all of the projects are favorable. We have had some a lot of discussion in CBOC about that, of course, on a more detailed level. But the thing to keep in mind in a bond budgeting process is, even though there's line items, on a document that identify scope, until you're physically in that building, engineering and tearing down walls and doing things, actual cost is something that ultimately occurs at the very end. But from a reliability and from a proven model perspective, all of the commitments that the district has made in this model we've been able to achieve, and plus some. Roofing is a line item that's been identified in phase 2, and Dr. Turnquist, identified the critical nature of the roof, regardless of what's inside, if that's not whole. And we have been able to, from a budgeting perspective, work in roofing in a few significant projects that ultimately then came off of phase 2. So where there have been opportunities from a savings perspective because of a competitive bidding environment and really getting into the marketplace at the right time, maximizing small businesses' opportunities and using them to help drive down, costing from a competitive perspective. All of those things help along the way from a budgeting perspective compared to the actual cost. But because of those successes in Phase 1, we are able to take, again, a roof at Northwest. Largely, that roofing was done in Phase 1. There's still a small portion that needs to be done, so that's in Phase 2, but it's not the entire roof. So I know, again, we can get some comparables for the board if they would like to see kind of how projects in the budgeting has worked. Again, where there's a need from a commitment perspective, we move program contingency to support that. We don't manage just monetarily and just kind of, well, that's the budget, that's all you get, campus, just forget about it. We really make sure from a community perspective in the ed spec process that, you know, this component really needs to be in there. Was it in the assessment? We've had, you know, plenty of those types of conversations, again, at the CBOC monthly discussions. But the right thing to do for the kiddos and ultimately the community that the buildings serve is to do this scope of work or make sure, you know, the parking at Beveridge is adequate, you know, with the city's requirements. Sometimes the city puts additional requirements on that, frankly, again, you're not going to know about in any of this assessment work because there's zero project development done. So until you do some of those, you know, we want to make sure we're planning to make sure all of the commitments made get completed. This spring, the last, actually, early to mid-October projects for the final phase of construction go out to bid. And then as those finish in the early spring, we'll be able to come back to district leadership and the board and identify, you know, potential savings that might need to be seen. Don't know what that figure looks like at this point in time, but from a trending perspective, again, the monthly reports and all that information is available for everybody in the public. It looks very favorable.
Thank you. Sure. Another, I guess, just touching off of what Mark Snow was saying about career education. You know, I'm a huge advocate for career education. One of the things I'd love to see the district do is coordinate and collaborate with Metro Community College, because the North Omaha campus just had, I think, 3 or 4 buildings built. And, I mean, I had the opportunity to tour it, top-notch facilities. They're doing the South Omaha campus for those programs that they're taking away from South Omaha, moving them to North Omaha, and they're redeveloping those spaces. And the proximity of the North Omaha campus to North High School and the South Omaha Metro Community College campus to South Omaha is much more convenient than currently in the TAC building. And I would just push for the administration to work with Metro Community College to offer, you know, I know dual credit has been set up, but also to utilize their facilities, and that could be a great stepping stone to determine if we as a district need a career technical high school, or if we can utilize our and partner with our community college, because they've just done great renovations on their spaces. And then the last one, you know, don't want to play Debbie Downer, but has it been presented to the steering committee and asked them to consider if we have an unsuccessful hiring of a superintendent on the bond issue? You know, I want to be upbeat and say, yes, we're going to find our next leader, but, you know, we have had one fail, and I want to make sure that we have a contingency plan in place, that if we're unable to find the next leader of our school district, do we lose all support of a second phase of the bond? So I think that just needs to be discussed, and, you know, hopefully it's a moot point, but I think it should be discussed.
We did not have a lot of conversation on that. I think in the first meeting, there were some conversations about multiple concerns, and that was kind of one of the list of things that could impact the successful passage of a bond issue. But it was one of the items. We didn't really spend a lot of time on it. We kind of moved on, but we can come back and have that conversation. But we moved kind of past that, because part of the reason they were talking about it was November versus May. And that was part of the logic on the November folks on the steering committee was there'd be less chance, I think this was one of the comments from one of the committee members, for a fumble, to fumble the ball. So it was mentioned, but not a lot of time spent on it.
Ms. Ryan?
As far as guidance from individual board members, I think I am also on board to start kind of moving forward and having those conversations with board leadership about what we're seeing in our schools, in our sub-districts, and if there's any things that we really want to see in this next phase, potential phase of the bond. So that's kind of where I'm sitting, because I know I'm in the process, just as Mrs. Cassidy is, of going to our schools and seeing what's going on in the buildings, and almost ready to start meeting with you guys to give you some lists. Okay.
Mrs. Godding?
So just a couple thoughts here as we're kind of wrapping up. You know, we went back to the timing thing, and one of the reasons that I was such an advocate for November was specifically because of the capacity issues. And I know I've talked many times about how deplorable it is and the conditions that we've put our kids in South Omaha, and how appalled I am that we've continued to allow that to happen. So I know that we're not going to get there in November because we haven't done all the work that needs to be done. So I understand we're moving toward May, but I don't think we can wait a whole lot longer on that. That's unfortunate. Coming back to the career education piece, I know that we did have the workshop a year ago with curriculum. Board members at the time were, and it might be a good one to go back and listen to for those of you who are new, were not necessarily supportive of moving forward with a career center, even though I know Mr. Evans has sent staff kind of all over the Midwest, I feel like, to take a look at facilities. I know that while I was board president, I continued to meet with different leadership in the community and within curriculum on that particular point. I don't know that anything's been done since then, but I know that that was a really big issue. I think that where I saw community support going more was along the lines of what Mr. Scanlon has pointed out. I don't think there was a whole lot of support for a standalone facility. I think that where I saw support, and which we all, I think, recognized would be the best route to take, was something more. And I don't know where that stands today, but I know that, you know, we were working on it back in November, December of last year. Was probably the last time I had conversations. So I guess I would encourage board leadership to bring us some information on that, because that was a big item and we did have a workshop on it. I would agree.
And I will say that the model that Mr. Scanlon's referring to, that is, I think, the model that you see more school districts using. Lincoln is using that model. They have a facility at Southeast Community College where the Lincoln Public School students can go and do career education and get those dual enrollment credits. So I think that is definitely a conversation that we can start with our Metro colleagues to kind of build that conversation and see where their thinking is as well. I wrote a note, and Ms. Gunn, I think you raised a good point earlier this evening. That is definitely something we're going to have to think about how we communicate it out, and that's the project versus program budget. Because I remember during the first bond issue having those discussions of people saying, well, it says we have $10 million, but you're saying you're only spending $6 million. What's the difference? Because I think we had presented the smaller number and then went to the full program cost. And so we just need to discuss, you know, as a board and with the steering committee, how are we going to effectively communicate that to explain this is what the number is, this is what it means, this is what's built into these numbers this time. We are, I think Mr. Perlman brought up a good point, there are kind of two separate things within this bond. There's new construction to deal with our capacity issue, which are something that it's unfortunate were not addressed in prior years. We went 15 years without a bond issue when most urban districts kind of routinely do a bond issue about every 5 years or so. You just expect there to be a bond issue to address capacity, to address those major capital things like heating and cooling systems that you just don't plan for. I don't know many homeowners that set aside money every month to pay for when their furnace goes out. It's one of those capital improvements, so when it comes up, you take care of it. So that's definitely something we're still playing catch up on. I am very glad that our previous board included money in the first bond issue to purchase land for not just high schools, but for the elementary schools as well. Because if you go way, way back in our initial things, we did not include that. And that was something we kind of towards the end said, no, if we're buying high school land, we need to buy elementary school land because we knew the need was there. So I am definitely also supportive of taking steps to move forward. For May, I think we can work on a timeline with administration to bring back that would hopefully have us going out and doing those community meetings, doing the small group meetings, and doing an actual resolution before the statutorily required deadline, so that we're not waiting until March to make a final decision. I think if everyone is on board that we can do that before then. Dr.
So then
Holman.
what exactly is the very next step in making the process move forward then?
So the next step would be board officers and administration building a timeline to bring back to the board for the board to, I believe we would vote on approving that timeline with the steps as far as community meetings, small group meetings, and then eventual voting on a bond resolution.
So the approval for the timeline would be at our next board meeting then?
Next board meeting? Like October?
Yeah,
I don't know.
our next meeting would be October 2nd. Like,
Didn't know it was gonna be that fast, but okay.
Dr. Turnquist is nodding her head that that's possible. And that would be
Yes, we will have a
timeline,
timeline for you to vote on October 2nd.
timeline, not the final scope and projects, just the timeline. Any other, Mrs. Gotti?
Well, I have a question. I guess, I don't remember voting on a timeline before, but I don't want to hold this up on, the goal should be to send, so if we have to vote on a timeline, that's fine. But I just want to make sure that, every little step, we're not having to take a vote. We should just be saying in general, I kind of thought before when we all said, in general, we should be moving forward. I kind of thought in March or February or whenever that we were moving forward. And then again in June, we had another bond workshop and I thought we were moving forward. And so I feel like every time we meet, I'm kind of like Mr. Perlman. I feel like, okay, we're moving forward. I just want to know at what point, let's just get it done. So, sorry.
Mr. Perlman?
I think I'm going to backtrack a little bit here, but I think it's an important thing to bring up in between now and our next meeting. Since so many of these, if not every single one, the vast majority of the things that have been recommended for Phase 2 of the bond, other than the new buildings, is, I'll just read it. Capital improvement to the existing building. Plan provides heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system updates along with other improvements to increase building system efficiencies. That's what it says, building after building after building after building. And Ms. Gotting brought up a good point, and I really want that flushed out. Is that something that we should be doing every 5, 10, 15 years? I want to know, like, for example, Benson High, that's in there for Benson High. I want to know what that means. It says in here, air handling unit replacement. I don't know that I need, every single detail, but maybe I do. If we're spending $10 million on HVAC, and I know Benson is really clamoring for a health sciences vocational, program and, space to do that. And I know we should be looking at partnering with our already existing partners on that as well. But I just feel like I want some details on that. I am in favor of moving forward. We need capital improvements at schools. We definitely need new schools. but if we're going to be spending 40, 60, 80 million dollars on HVAC, I do want to know if that's something we can push out 3 years, 9 years, 12 years from now, and maybe prioritize other things.
Dr. Turnquist?
Well, most of the things in there are things that need to be addressed right now, or within 2 years, or within 5 years. But what we can do for you on those systems is provide to you the normal lifespan. Here's what we're proposing here. This would be the normal lifespan for that new system. The other thing I would point out is that even now in the current bond, we're working with Benson on the facility for those science and health programs. So those things are already underway, and we're not going to ignore those things. Also, as we work through a building, and I would let Mark expand on this a little more, we're going to handle cosmetic changes where that is in the best interest of that particular school building, but we're just not going to go through and remodel the entire building if it doesn't need that. And as you mentioned earlier, there are some additions in some of those buildings. You know, I want to share my favorite story from the first bond, and that was when I went to Gilder to speak at their groundbreaking. And you know, I spent 36 years in South Omaha, so part of my heart is there. And when the program was over and I was walking back to the parking lot to my car, past those horrible portables, and the children were all running back to class in the portables, and they all stopped and turned around, came running back, and said, "Thank you." That's really what this is about.
Mrs. Godding?
Well, I'll share one final thought, and that's my story from Ponca. And the story there was when we asked the kids what they really wanted was heat and lights and to be able to see their papers. And so we're still in that situation in some schools. And so we really, really need to, I don't know what else we need to do, but we just need to move forward and get us the data that we need to have so that we can make the decisions. And I've said it many times, I'll say it one more time tonight, which is in the 2014, I mean, Mr. Wayne was the board president, I was the vice president. We worked very closely on coming up with, and Jeremy was there, so he clearly remembers all of the, I mean, we've spent hard hours in front of whiteboards trying to figure out what we needed to do. And then we met in individual small groups with different board members from different parts of the community so that we could then come forward with something. So I do think it's really important that we get to that place, and I don't need to vote on that every time. I just need us to move forward.
Mr. Scanlon?
I guess what I'm hearing is that maybe we don't need to vote on a timeline next meeting. What we need to vote on is just that this board is committed to pursuing a bond issue that we would like to have on the ballot in the spring, May of 2018. Obviously, that commitment would not be any dollar amount or anything like that, but that's the direction that we want to go. So that should give the administration enough leeway to, go through and the board doesn't try to, have to oversee it, every single detail. The administration can see it as best that they oversee it, which would best flow it to get us the bond resolution that we could vote on as soon as possible to get onto that May ballot. I think that would just maybe be satisfactory from what I'm hearing for most board members.
From my perspective, just one note, the steering committee wants a vote, whether it's a timeline or a commitment to a resolution May 2018, they do want a vote. Many of them feel kind of what Ms. Godding's saying too, that we need to see action and hands in the air. And so I'm just reflecting what I heard from steering committee members. They want something And we're okay either way with a commitment to a resolution that will be on the May 2018 ballot or timeline. We can do either one. We don't have any problem with that, but I do think we need a board vote for the steering committee. I think they really want that and have asked for that.
How about we provide a timeline to Mr. Ray to share with you before the October 2nd? And then that, as Mr. Evans says, a vote to move forward towards that bond issue would be great. You know, at my age, I have to keep moving or I fall over.
Thank you for your service, Dr. Turnquist.
Any other board comments? Okay, sounds like we've given some direction. So we will work with administration to develop that timeline and bring it back so we can do a vote committing to a bond issue at our next meeting. Mr. Snow.
I move that the Board of Education go into closed session for the protection of the public interest and for the prevention of needless injury to the reputation of individuals to discuss with the Superintendent, Connie Kanoki, Secretary to the Board, and Legal Counsel, pending litigation.
Is there a second?
Second. Oh.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Snow and a second by Dr. Holman. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, roll call, please, Mr. Ray.
Ryan.
Aye.
Scanlon. Snow.
Aye.
Cassidy.
Aye.
Gadding.
Aye.
Hallman.
Aye.
America.
Aye.
Perlman.
Aye.
8
Motion carried. Let me remind the board that the purpose for closed session is for the protection of the public interest and for the prevention of needless injury to the reputation of individuals, to discuss with the superintendent, Connie Kanoki, secretary to the board, and legal counsel pending litigation. Let the record reflect that the board went into closed session at 7:44 p.m. Now they're on. Let the record reflect the board came out of closed session at 7:53 PM. Let the record reflect the meeting is adjourned at 7:53 PM.